Welcome everybody to Raising Multilinguals Live. This is Tetsu Young from Ask Tetsu.
Welcome. My name is Rita from multilingualparenting.com.
Welcome everyone. My name is Rita from Uta's International Lounge. We are very honored to have Dr. Sabine Little as our guest today. She's lecturer in language education at the University of Sheffield and will tell us more about how children and parents can collaborate in home language maintenance. Now, Sabine, maintaining a home language abroad is one of the main worries we have as multilingual parents or parents who raise multilingual children. Because how can we make sure that our children will keep speaking our languages with us, especially when the community of the school language is another one? And like in your case that you're going to tell us about today, when the community and school language is also one of the home languages, right? So I'd like to just jump in because the idea of inviting you today, one among others, came from an article that you wrote about the topic. And what we found interesting was that you co-authored an article with your son.
That's right.
Based on a joint research, I'm quoting you now from there, joint research diary where you chronicled both language-related conversations and your emotions linked to the process of bringing back the heritage language. So you focused, so to say, on both horizons, again quoting you, in an intergenerational way, creating what you called also an un/familiar place. So, or third place, you call it also like that. Can you please share with us what preceded this reintroduction in the first place and how this all looked and felt like?
Sure. I think first of all, thank you for having me. And in terms of how this situation evolved, I think is a very common tune that many parents will have experienced. So I was born and raised in Germany. I moved to the UK to study. And then stayed, met my husband, who is British, and we had a child together. And while I was on maternity leave, the child was getting, our son, Toby, he will appear several times because he is the co-author. So Toby got a lot of German in the home. And then when I went back to work, I still had one full day with him. And so he still had quite a bit of German. And then at some point, school started. And he was getting confused, he says, because I was both the parent who was the only parent who could speak German to him, while also being the main parent who would go through his learning to read exercises that school sent home. So I'd said we were never a strict one parent, one language family, but I suddenly had this very much dual role of supporting both German on my own and English literacy development through what school sent home. And my son then actually asked, he was 4 years old at the time, and he actually said, he didn't say he wanted to stop, he didn't reject German, but he said, could he take a year out of speaking German? So he actually asked for a break. And after 1 year, he said, could he take another year out? And at that point, as a language educator, specialist, researcher, I could see the German, you know, I thought that was it. I thought, oh, great, I'm going to be a languages researcher working on multilingualism with a child who is absolutely monolingual in English only. But I had promised myself a long time ago that I would be his mother first and a languages researcher second. So I felt duty bound to honor what he was asking for. And then thankfully, when he got to 6 years old, he said he wanted to restart learning German. And I think in his head, he would just flick a switch and the German would be back again. But that was sort of the point where we were at the start of the study, that Toby had for 2 years spoken very, very little German. I mean, I might have said gute Nacht, good night, or, you know, very, very small things. But in principle, the German had pretty much atrophied. And I was doing some work with other families. And I was telling Toby about it, that I was talking to other children who are growing up multilingual. And he was saying, I think I'm ready now. I think I want to do German again. Can we do research together? So at that point, he was about 6.5, and that takes us to the starting point of the study that then evolved.
Ute needs to switch her microphone on.
Thank you. So you just shared what triggered the reintroduction of the heritage language. And how did the collaboration with your son look like? Because you said now that he was 6 years old.
Yeah, it was really interesting because, as I said, I was doing research and he said, I want to do research. And I said, okay, what do you mean by this? We had at first a few discussions of, when you say you do research, and he says, I want to do it properly. I want to do everything. So I said, well, proper research will involve an ethics application, and then we have to decide how we are going to do this, and we have to stick to that. And then at the end, we might even write about it and publish it. And I said, well, what bits of this do you want to do? And he said, I want to do everything. So we dutifully put together an ethics application that went through the University of Sheffield, where I work. It wasn't a funded study in any way, because I thought, well, if it goes down the hill, then I don't want him to feel any pressure to continue. But we put in for a 2.5-year autoethnographic study. So we decided we would study ourselves. And what we did was essentially that for 2.5 years, we wrote down exchanges, so our conversations, however they happened in languages. So verbatim, Toby said this, Mummy said this, and we write it down, mistakes and everything. So there was a language aspect. But what transpired really quickly was that we were both feeling a lot of emotions as part of this. Toby was incredibly frustrated. I said early on that he felt that he would just start speaking German again. He hadn't quite understood that while he was not using his German, it had disappeared. And at some point, I think he called it his zombie German, because he was resurrecting it from the dead, so to speak. So what we did was, at first we wrote down all these exchanges in the diary, but then to help us explore the emotions that we were feeling, we would write things down and leave them alone. And then a couple of days later, we would look back over what we had written and just gently try and explore our feelings towards each other and what had happened during that exchange. So we might sort of say, well, it sounded to me like you were getting a bit frustrated there, or I could tell that I wasn't getting anywhere. I didn't really know how to continue there, and I would admit to feelings of absolute inadequacy as a mother to try and make this work. And I've got a couple of examples as well where I was the one giving up. He said he wanted me to speak German at all times. I don't think I lasted 48 hours, to be perfectly honest, with that, because when you have an inquisitive 6-year-old who asks lots of different questions but doesn't understand what you're telling him, life just got too frustrating. So we had these two aspects that we wrote down things verbatim, but then explored the underlying emotions. And you mentioned a fusion of horizons is what it was called in the literature, and we adapted this. So this idea that he was obviously experiencing all this from one perspective and I was experiencing it from a different perspective. What we were trying to do with our conversations was to try and understand each other's perspectives. And there is research on what's called third space theory, where everybody leaves their own space and tries to come together in a third space. And for our paper, when we ended up writing it up, we talked about it as an unfamiliar space, because it was sort of both familiar to us because we knew each other, but unfamiliar because we were exploring our relationship in a new way.
Yes, and how did this sound like, this unfamiliar space? Was it mainly in English then? Because this was probably the language that you both were speaking mostly, and that he, at that point, at that stage, was probably more fluent in?
Yeah, I think the emotional discussions were mainly in English with German examples. Yeah, not all, but mainly, and that fluctuated as he got more confident. But it was more important to us and to me that I understood his emotions and his experiences than trying to force him to make sense of what he was feeling in a language he wasn't confidently speaking. To me, it was more important that he felt confident that I was supporting him, whatever his decision was, whatever his journey was, than it was to try and push for grammatical accuracy or anything like that. And we have one example that I'm writing up at the moment that's not actually in the paper that's out yet, where he talks about loving me, and he made a grammatical error. And I just couldn't bring myself to correct it, because essentially I thought, well, if you tell me you love me, I couldn't care less how many mistakes are in that. But actually, when he found out that he'd made a mistake, he got really cross with me, because in his interpretation, saying that he loves me in correct German to him was more meaningful than in English or in grammatically incorrect German. So to a certain extent, in his view, this accuracy or striving towards accuracy was part of getting it right, of sort of sharing his love. And
can I just give a quick comment? You have an extraordinarily wonderful son.
Oh, bless you. Well, it was interesting because we had to talk about it, because I felt very loved in that moment, but I also wanted for him to feel clear that I feel his love no matter what the language. It's not that it's more meaningful to me if it's grammatically correct in German, but it was to him. So this was one of those examples where we had to unpick how we felt about different things at different times, and on the basis of this conversation we discussed. So he said that I should correct him, and I said, well, yeah, but sometimes you get frustrated when I correct you. And I said I would much prefer to model, to say things back. So if he would say, you're the best mum in the world, but he said it grammatically incorrect, and I said, oh, I think you're the best son in the world, or you think I'm the best mum in the world. So I would do all this modeling thing, and he got not angry, but he said, that's really mean, because you're expecting me to always be on my toes and sort of second guess why you are saying something to me. Are you saying it because you mean it, or are you saying it because you're modeling and you're expecting me to pick up on that and then get it right myself afterwards? I was like, oh wow, I'd never thought of that. So he said he would much prefer to be corrected outright, and then he knew that something was wrong. And when I said, yeah, but sometimes you get frustrated, what we ended up with was essentially, if he made a mistake and I felt that it was something that was sort of worth picking up and worth taking on, I said, well, do you want to know how to say it correctly? And he would just gauge himself whether he was, whether he was feeling particularly fragile or confident at the time, or whether he was more interested in the flow of conversation. And on the basis of that, he would say yes or no. And then whatever he decided, we went with.
So Rina, it's only been 15 minutes that we've been listening to you talk, and I can't recall a session where we've been so deep in the emotional aspects of parenting. And often when I talk to parents, I always remind them, within multilingual parenting, a lot of the success comes from the parenting and not the multilingual knowledge and all the theory or the grammar and all that. And clearly this is an example where you have a very good connection with the recipient, the child, this trust element in here where you can openly and frankly discuss the emotions. I mean, even documenting it is, it's fantastic. But the fact that you can say this and that and correct the course of action, everything is just it's like a textbook case of taking everything, the parenting side and really applying it. And I think our audience is I think, right along the same wavelength here. We've got lots of comments right now happening, starting with Heather. You know, she was already very excited to see this this session. Let me just put this on. She's been okay, and we've got comments, lots of wows. Kudos to your attitude to put the mom's role. This, you know, clearly reflects what I felt when I first heard you say this. You know, you want to put the mom role first before the language researcher. That really hit home. So and Heather also agrees. So again, just wanted to put in a comment. I didn't have any questions, but just wanted to throw out there my feelings right now.
Yes, I have an additional question, because as Tetsu says, this approach through emotions, putting the child first and letting the child lead the way. And we're talking about a 6-year-old. I don't know now if this metalinguistic discourse that you had, these conversations about when to be corrected, when not, when you feel comfortable about this, when this happened, if it happened also when he was 6, or was it at a later stage? But what I wonder is how this would have been different if he wouldn't have been so adamant, you know, because children who are 6-year-old children, I mean, we know sometimes they say something and after five days, they just don't think about this anymore. So he was very determined, and it's admirable for a child of that age. And this is it's a great situation for you that you could go through this for so many years and then reintroduce the language, etc. But sometimes we parents, we have these situations when we skip one language, or we put it in the background, and then every now and then we read a book in that language and reintroduce it, and we have a friend come over just to testing if the child is ready. At least it's what I did. And my son, it took him many more years. He was 11 and he stopped when he was 4.5. So it was a bit more time in between. But I wonder, when can we say as parents, okay, now we can take on the wagon and start this? We don't have to do a research, right, about this. But what are the signs actually that made you decide, okay, now this is very serious? Probably you know your son, of course, but
yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that. I was in a position where obviously I had a child who was very happy to be involved, and I also had this the fact that it was my work, so I had stories to share from my other research, and I don't think this is necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach. You know, at the age of 6.5, your child will be ready, as you say. I think each child is very much individual, but I do think whether you do a research project or not, the underlying principles of saying, I want to work with you on this, I want you to help me understand how to do this. One example was about, I talk a lot when I do my research. I find out about, you know, where do you speak which language and with whom and how does that work? And my husband doesn't speak German. So even after Toby had asked for German to be reintroduced, we didn't always speak German when my husband was in the room, because we felt that would exclude him from family conversations. But when I had a chat with Toby about that, and I said, well, when would be good to speak German? And he said, in the car, which was a brilliant idea, because I was the one at the time who would mostly, not always, but mostly drive him to different activities and things like that. So we actually had quite a bit of time where it was just him and me in the car, and it created this kind of German bubble, where, you know, you ended up in the car and that was the German space. So I think there's lots of different things that can work, and you're absolutely right, they don't work all the time and they don't always work. We didn't always speak German in the car, and as you said, sometimes it was, you know, it was a friend coming over or meeting somebody. But if you stick with your child and you keep trying to throw opportunities at them, and what they do take on board or what they want to run with. I've lost count of the numbers of books that I've been able to buy, you know, citing financial privilege, because if my son said, "Oh, I love Der kleine Drache Kokosnuss," you know, I was right there on Audible, and I was there with the next 5 audiobooks just so he had some German to listen to because he'd said so. So, and I think in the paper itself, he said something like, and I'm not sure how much sense it makes within the paper, but here's something like, go where your child wants to go. If your child's into dinosaurs, then go with that. So I think for Toby, it was the idea of doing research. I think, to be perfectly honest, we probably could have done research on something else if that had been, you know, he could have been interested in something else, but doing the research project was the way he made sense of it all. But I think different children might find different ways of making sense of their experiences.
Absolutely, yeah. And I would like to come back to your husband. You mentioned that your husband does not speak German. And so when you reintroduced German, you had these special moments where he was not in the room or in the car. What effect did this have, generally speaking, on your husband, knowing that you're reintroducing German and that maybe he walks into the room and doesn't know what you're talking about, or generally speaking, just?
Yeah, I have a very easygoing husband. I should start with that, and I don't think he ever felt in any way threatened or excluded. And I think I think he probably understands more German than he gives himself credit for. There were occasions in the car. There is a memorable one that I think we cite in the paper, where we were going in the car as a family, and it was, I'll quickly retell this anecdote, but essentially I was trying to find out from my son, who was doing a sort of a drama show thing, and I needed to know whether he needed a snack on Wednesday. So the question was, on Wednesday, when it's your show, will you need a snack? Which in English would have taken us exactly 10 to 12 seconds to sort out. But I started in German, and it was like, on Wednesday, when it's your show, and he interrupted me and he got stuck on Wednesday. What is Wednesday, essentially? So this happened in German. I said, okay, well, look, you know, first it's Monday, then it's Tuesday, then it's Wednesday. And this evolved into, I think, 10, 15 minutes of frustration. And at the end, we realized, when we went back to this 2 days later, so I wrote it down more or less verbatim as well as I could. And when we came to this discussion 2 days later, I realized that if only I'd sort of gone as far as snack, which I would have said in, you know, that would have been the same word in English or in German, he would have twigged what I was talking about, and he wouldn't have got caught up with the Wednesday, just like I did. So we were trying to use experiences like this to think of. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that, especially initially, I tried to simplify my language as much as I could to create opportunities. And I guess in a way that also helped my husband, because it meant that, you know, he while he doesn't speak German, he's obviously, even through Toby's childhood, been around me speaking German and the songs and the videos and things like that. So it's not that he's completely fresh to it, but I don't think I've ever heard him utter a single German sentence ever. So I think it is fair to say that he understands some German, but doesn't speak much of it. But I think, again, in putting the family first and trying not to create exclusive spaces, we try to circumvent that.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Yeah. I wanted to talk about this experience in your car journey, but I think it's another one, or is it the one that you just mentioned about when you lapsed into English? There was another example in one of your articles. I think it's another one where then your son's perspective, what was your and your son's perspective about this relapsing? Because of course, reintroducing a language means to go back and forth, and to have periods of, like you said, where you speak very much longer in the target language to make the child get used to it and to understand everything that you're saying.
Yeah. And I think I've just spotted the comment by Hugo saying the correct way. And I think you're absolutely right. I didn't say the correct way of saying it, but it's in terms of how would you say it, essentially. But yeah, sorry, to come back to your question, Uta. It was one instance. So our car journey home from I can't remember where, but from Sheffield to us, it takes about 45 minutes in the car. So that was, as a sort of frame, that was just him and me in the car. And in the space of this one car journey, anybody who's got inquisitive 6-year-olds at home will recognize this. He asked about succulents, so desert plants. Then he said, "Mummy, what is narcolepsy?" And then a bit later, he came out with, autism, how does it work? And that was 45 minutes.
How old was he again at this time?
He was 6. He was 6 at the time. So they were words that he'd sort of picked up wherever. And I started out, with the succulents. I said, well, they are plants that grow in the desert. What's desert? Okay, right. It's where it's really, really dry and there's lots of sand. So you ended up going down every word that he didn't understand. You ended up going down another alleyway, because with every explanation there would be another word he didn't understand. So you went to explain that, and then that, and then that, and you just went further and further away from what he was actually wanting to know about. And we did all right with the succulents, but by the time we got to autism, narcolepsy, we sort of did away with essentially saying, people sleep a lot. But by the time we got to autism, I actually thought, these are really important questions, especially that one. I wanted to know where he'd heard the word, what made him ask about it. Was there something that he'd come across? Was it something he'd heard from peers? Or I didn't want to foreground the language. I wanted to make sure that he felt he could ask questions that he might. I wasn't quite sure which aspects of the questions that he was asking were simply I want to know, or were really necessary to develop a deeper understanding of the people that he was living with, encountering, etc. So on some of these occasions, I just threw the German out the window and I went, yes, okay, let's talk about this. And we just used, so sometimes we started in German and just ended up in English. And in this particular example, when we talked about it 2 days later, I said, I feel like I'm not doing this right. You said you wanted me to speak German all the time, and I just can't do it. I'm just failing as a mother. I didn't say it quite like that, but it was. I mean, the guilt, the parental guilt, is fairly well documented in multilingual family research. So I said to him, I think the reflection itself says, I feel like I'm clipping your wings. Whichever way I go, if I use German only, I'm clipping your wings in terms of developing an understanding of these topics. But if I dip into English, whereas you asked me to stick to German, I'm clipping your wings and developing the language skills. And it was him at that point who said, it's fine. I know I said speak German, but we'll be all right. Or as we say in Yorkshire, we'll be all right. And as he himself said, as my German gets better, we'll be able to have more conversations in German, and it'll be all right in the end. So actually, he took a longer term stance, and I think that was really important. He flicked very quickly from this initial perspective that he would just be able to speak German again. He then very quickly understood it as a long term endeavor, you know, something that wouldn't happen overnight. And I think, again, the fact that we said we would do the study for 2.5 years if we felt like it, I think that was always understood, you know, if we felt like carrying on, made him realize that this wasn't something that was going to happen again overnight. And I think that helped with his own expectations, and also with the way we sort of treated each other in getting to that point.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very important point that you make now, talking about the expectations from the child that is involved, and the expectations from the parents. Because I remember very vividly then when my son asked me that to reintroduce Italian at when he was 11, I was thrilled, I was over the moon. But then I realized, okay, the last time that we had a real conversation together in Italian, you were 4 years old, now you're 11. So I cannot reconnect there because he's interested in completely different things. Yeah. He was using much more complicated and sophisticated sentences in English and all the other languages. So I think the gap was quite big. And would you think, well, I think it's logic that at that point, maybe reintroducing a language that you have stopped speaking with the child regularly. I mean, I spoke the language still with part of my family and friends, but not with my son. That we have to take this into account, that it will not, first of all, it will not happen overnight. It will not happen within a year or 2 years, maybe 3 years, to get where I think we can go, or where he expects to go, or the child expects to go. And at that point, when my son was 11, we did a little language plan and like a contract. Okay, we're going to speak during the weekends and we're going to do this and that and that. And that was fine, but then we had also to adjust it. And my question now is, not how many times did you adjust your plan? I think it's too much. We would maybe talk for 3 hours, but was this also something that you discussed regularly with your son? We are here now, we thought we might be there, but it still needs a little bit of time.
I don't think we had a language, we had no language related goals as such. We literally, he said he wanted to speak German again, and wherever he ends up, you know, anything that he did was going to be more than what he had. It's quite interesting. In a previous study of mine, I talked to parents and did a survey, and I think we had about 212, I think, responses, and asked parents for their plans for their children. And it was quite nuanced in terms of sort of 4 skills: listening, speaking, reading, writing, and whether sort of working knowledge, being able to sort of hold a conversation, or maybe, you know, a couple of years below what you might expect. This was in terms of reading of a child who would grow up in that country, or only. We all realize it's an artificial construct, but it was in there to try and understand what parents were saying. You know, only fully balanced bilingual will do for us. That was one of the options. And then there was also the option, I'm going to be led by my child in you know, how this goes. And so the options were something like, you know, I will make this happen, essentially, hell or high water. I'm pushing for this, I'm hoping for this, and then I will be led by my child with this. And it was interesting that the higher the language skill or development, the more likely parents were to say, I will be led by my child. So it was interesting that in terms of what parents were pushing for was largely sort of a working knowledge, you know, being able to cope in the language, shall I say. And I think quite a few parents, I forget the exact numbers, but by the time it got to, I want my child to be a fully balanced bilingual, it was most like I think there were still about 30% of parents who said that you know, that's what I'm going to do. But it was much more likely that parents were saying, do you know what, I'm going to take my child, you know, we'll see how it goes. And I think that is really important. I should maybe say, that I'm stood here. You know, my son is now he's 13 now. I don't think I've said that yet. And he's in a GCSE German class. So his spoken German is pretty good. His grammar is still not, you know, it's still a long way from what a GCSE marker would want to see when you look at cases and other grammatical points. But he is happy with how it's going, and he feels confident to express himself in German. I think that was the other thing that was the most important to me. I wanted to focus less on mistakes and more on willingness to engage. So at the moment, I feel a bit sad that this is being recorded because he might change his mind. I'm going to say this. At the moment, he thinks he wants to go to university in a German-speaking country. That's what he thinks at the moment. I reserve his right to change his mind. So if somebody sees this in a few years, well, he never went to Germany. But what makes me happy is that he is considering that as an option. Because to me, it shows that he's embracing that as a potential part of his future, and he sees it as a possibility as part of his identity. And to me, that is more important than making sure he knows the female accusative, or so I think it's, to me, the attitude behind it was more important than actual accuracy.
Sabine, I feel so proud of your son right now. I don't know the kid, but
he's all right. We'll keep him.
My goodness, it's amazing. We've got comments in the chat box. I don't know if you were looking. There's many comments on your son. I mean, we're all proud of you too, but it's incredible. Your son's attitude, I think, is something that really strikes me as something special here. But I do want to recognize again, it's this cultivating of this trusting relationship that you have with your child that I believe led to a lot of this success. So again, I commend this parenting aspect of your whole research. So
Yes, and in your research, you were talking about reintroducing the language that you were speaking with your son before switching to English at some point, right? In my case, it's slightly different, and I know other families, there is also slightly different. They want to reintroduce a language that they were speaking to some extent at some point and then reintroduce it later. So it's like, it looks a bit like a patchwork, you know? But the base language or the main language that they are speaking or were speaking with the child was still the same, but they would add another one. Like in my case, it was the case. And to add just, I didn't have high expectations. I said I would be happy if we could just have a conversation, 8 to 10 turns together without switching back and forth too much in somewhere in the future. But my son had very clear idea. He said, I want to be able to read Harry Potter in Italian. And I said, well, you know, this is a goal, but we have to be prepared that it takes a bit longer. And knowing that he's a fast reader, already was then, he was very much frustrated very quickly. He said, okay, well, it's easy to read. Italian's easier than English, but he couldn't read it in the pace that he expected. So there were some kind of expectations that were not met. So it's a back and forth between, you know, him feeling guilty, me feeling guilty because I didn't think that we were going there at the pace that he wanted. Maybe the approach should be different. How can I make an approach only in the weekend because this is what we agreed on? So I think there are, as you said, so many different ways to do it and to help our children get there. But if we let us lead by them, it's an amazing journey to reintroduce a language. I would like to acknowledge one comment here from Malvina Gudowska. I can relate, this refers to what you said before. I can relate to so much of this, Sabine, personal and research. I often start in Polish and end in English in those tough moments, and often feel like I'm clipping so many wings. And this is a bit related to what I said. This feeling of clipping wings, it's very familiar to me as well.
Yeah, I think it's really, I think as parents, with every, or with many no matter how supportive we try to be, you know, if ever, are you going to wear that? Slips out, we're going to clip a wing, you know, if ever, you know, it's, I think the one thing, and I'm definitely not a parenting guru by any stretch of the imagination, you know, I make so many mistakes all the time. Thankfully, I typically have my child to put me right. But I think something you said about your son sort of wanting to read Harry Potter, it struck a chord, because I think especially when it comes to literacy development and asynchronous literacy development, I've done quite a bit of work on this. And in one of my studies, I worked again with children to share with me what kind of strategies they had developed as part of their sort of asynchronous literacy development. And there were really clever things happening. So, you know, whether they were first reading one book in one language and then reading the same book in the other language, and that happened both first with a more confident language or first with a less confident language, depending on what the child was feeling like, or listening to the audiobook whilst reading at the same time to just get over. And I think it's about this gap that happens both orally and especially in literacy. I've got one slide that I tend to use when I'm speaking, which shares the books that my son was reading when he was 9 in German and in English. And you just take one look at it and you go, of course he's going to read the English book, because it's the one where all the exciting stories are, because the book that he was reading in German was for a 6-year-old. And it was just not age appropriate. You know, it wasn't interesting. It wasn't fun. And he read it with determination and pig-headedness to try and get to the point where he could read the harder stuff. And I think there are lots and lots of ways we can support children, whether that is through audiobooks. I'm just going to say this quickly because it's something that it's from a different, well, it's something that we did in our family that I've since recommended to lots of families. We call it You Read Yours, I Read Mine. So we spent a lot of, we don't do it so much now, but we would both lie on the bed in the evening and I would read my book and he would read his book. And that meant that I wasn't there looking over his shoulder all the time. He was doing his own thing. But if there was a word that he was stuck on, he didn't have to interrupt he could just quickly ask me. He didn't have to look anything up. He didn't have to stop. He just could quickly ask for something. But then it also happened that one of us might chuckle or go, and it's like, what is it? What's happening? So we sort of kept an eye on what each other was reading as well. And that again made for lots of conversations about what we were reading. Sometimes he would say, this passage is too hard, and I would just read a whole paragraph to him. And it was just this fluid conversation while reading was happening. And we did that for a long, long time, not every night, but I would say over a period of maybe 3 or 4 years. And like I said, less so now because he's now quite a confident reader in German. But I think that's what helped us getting over that bridge and cultivated some lovely mutual reading experiences. And yeah, so maybe that is useful to some people.
Yes, absolutely. Or let them also read, if they have other siblings or friends, let them read aloud to others who do not speak the language yet or do understand it only in basis. But I would like to continue also with these audiobooks, because these were actually our saviors, because I found some audiobooks in Italian and then also in our other languages that helped us maintain our home languages, or the languages that we speak at home. And this leads me directly to my next question. It's about insights of the use of apps, because you also wrote an article about that. Apps and games that can help our children or motivate our children in the home or heritage languages, because there is so much out there, even more coming. So can you please share some insights about this?
Yeah, sure. So this was a study to exactly explore what is out there, how do families use it, and what do the children think about it? Because it was quite nuanced. When you talk to parents in research about what sort of apps they use, you're sort of missing the how does the child experience this? And through the research, I found that by and large, parents had 3 expectations. I'm generalizing slightly here, but sort of overarchingly, parents were hoping that an app or a game would motivate the child to learn the heritage language. It would also help teach the language, so actually make the language better, improve it in some way. And then in a perfect world, it would also keep the child entertained independently. And this was so different to when I talked to the same parents about what do you do with books in your family. It's, oh, we do shared reading. I read to my child, we do it together. So there was this added expectation on apps and games that they would, I'm going to say miraculously, again, I overgeneralize, but they would do more than books. So when it came to books, parents had this feeling of a shared responsibility. It was about creating emotional connections. When they talk about family reading, there were stories of, you know, under the duvet or on the favorite sofa or huddled up in the garden. There was all this extra multimodal, so, you know, smell, sound, feeling. But when it came to apps, it was more of a, well, I give him the iPad and off he goes. And that didn't work. And it didn't work for a number of reasons, partially because the child was missing the necessary parental input, but also because a parent's perception of what a fun app is was often very different from a child's perception of what a fun app is. And I think I can dutifully report that apps that get the child to practice the stroke order of Chinese characters and award points for whether the strokes are in the correct order or not are not perceived as fun by most children, but were perceived as a sort of gamified literacy game by the parents. So there was then you know, a discrepancy. I say, well, why is this not fun? You know, surely this. So again, I think it's about working with children, and Toby very kindly at some point tested apps for me. So again, it wasn't part of any research, but while I was doing the research on apps and games, I said, right, okay, I'm gonna get 10. You have a play, and you tell me which ones you enjoy, which ones you find useful, and then when I talk to other parents, I'm going to mention them, and I'm going to say that they come child approved. So again, it was about validating what the child was doing and giving it a real purpose. The other thing I wanted to just quickly say about this was that when it comes to apps and games, heritage language children are not a market. Foreign language learners are a market, and native, and any of this terminology I could talk about for a long time, but native language speakers who are 100% confident in that language and are growing up with it are a market. And my husband is a games and apps developer, so I speak from some attached experience. But because every heritage language child is different, Uta, you were saying that your son stopped a language age 4 and started again age 11. Mine stopped age 4.5, started again age 6.5. Those are 2 completely different experiences. Age 11, despite both being heritage language children, our children would have very different attitudes towards or language expectations of what an app might do. So there is no such thing as a universally applicable heritage language app, which means that parents are, again, same with sort of literacy, you know, do you go for stuff that is age inappropriate? You know, do you go for learning to spell apps in the language, even though the child might be 7, 8, 9 years old and is there with apps aimed at 3-year-olds? Or do you go with apps that are more age appropriate, but language wise completely over their heads? And we went down, because Toby was still quite young when we reintroduced language, so the gap wasn't quite so big. So at 6.5, he did play some of the sort of early literacy apps, and we're still quite happy with that. But we did play them together, and the apps that were harder language wise, we did together. We enjoyed them like you would enjoy a book. We experienced them together. We huddled up. We talked a lot. Whoa, what's going to happen? What do you think happens if I click here? You know, and we made that part of the experience. And I think that is the best way to make use of the technology that is out there to support heritage language development.
Absolutely. So the communication through and through, through reading, yeah, transmitting the heritage language also with the games and apps. I completely agree with you that the apps and games, depending when the child wants to approach that language, are not always a fit. Yeah, when the child is not able to read and then is maybe already 11 years old but can't read in the heritage language, and then you give him an app for a 6-year-old, it's not going to last. It's not going to help very much. Maybe it's a niche that could be explored by some app producer for someone who is 11 years old and wants to approach, I don't know, Chinese or German or whatever other language at that point, so that the topics are more age appropriate and more appealing for them. Yes. Let me quickly see if we have some more comments. Otherwise, I would like to ask you a question that we share with Tetsu and Rita. How can we ensure that our children need to belong to a group or an identity, in the sense the heritage culture or another kind of group, is satisfied when raising them in a heritage language?
I think that is such an important question, and I think it is partially why I focus a lot of my work on working with families who are not necessarily attached to a big language community where they are. So a lot of the research that I've done has been with families that are not always isolated, but you know, if they are connected to other families, then it's maybe part of a small group, or you know, there might be 3 or 4 families in around, but not really the sort of environment which you might get in, where you go to the corner shop and somebody will speak your language. So I think identity is the core aspect of my research. It's what I'm most interested in, and I think it is, again, partially because I'm interested in exploring how children and parents separately experience their identity, and then how they negotiate that as a family. And I think sometimes the hardest thing to tell a parent or to work with a parent is to say, your child may develop an identity that includes the heritage language, or they might not view it as part of their identity. Even if they speak it, they might not view it as part of their identity. It's really personal, and it's really squishy. And I often talk about Bonnie Norton's work. She's from Canada, and she talks about investment and belonging. And I say that if the parents are the ones who migrate to a country, then they have their experiences from the heritage language culture already there. And then if you move to a new country, you are somewhat invested because it's presumably your choice. Obviously, there are situations where it's not your choice, but by and large, with economic migrants, education migrants, you make, many families that I work with have made a conscious decision to move to a different country. And with that comes a sort of idea of, okay, I'm going to learn the language. You know, to what extent people necessarily want to be part of a community, but there's a choice. Whereas if a child is introduced to the culture that the parents left behind, or left in a different country, I should say, not necessarily left behind, but the parent wants the child to still be part of that culture and that language and that identity, I think that is a lot trickier, because the child doesn't always have personal experience of this, and certainly not to the same extent as somebody who grows up in that country. But also, it feels almost retrospective. It's something that the parent has left, even if it's intellectually or emotionally still there. Geographically, it's somewhere that the parent has left behind. And I do think, I hope I'm making this clear, I'm not saying that parents are necessarily not emotionally fully invested, but I do think there is something there for children and parents to unpack when it comes to identity development, that if you are trying to encourage belonging to something that is not part of your everyday life, that is just trickier to start with. And sorry,
yes.
Go on.
Yes, absolutely. It really just hit home for me, because I grew up abroad and I never lived in Germany, and I'm transmitting German now to my children as a second generation. So it felt already a bit watery what I have as German culture and identity, and it might feel even more diluted for my children. I define it like that, taking that as a metaphor. And I think with many parents I speak with, they are in a similar situation like I am. So they are living abroad, maybe in the fifth, sixth country, and the connection also with what they used to be and what they are now, that they are raising their children abroad with other languages and maintaining that language or those languages, seems like not very natural at some point. And this is also where they sometimes struggle as parents. I think we're talking about children here, but we also talk about the parents who are those who transmit this feeling and this sense of belonging and everything that comes with it, this feeling for being part of a group. Yeah. So if I'm not that sure that I still belong there, or if I ever belonged there, how can I transmit this to a child? This has nothing to do necessarily with language, but as language and psychology and everything is linked. Yeah. I think it's important to talk about that, or to be aware of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's absolutely fine for the child. It's hard. It's painful, but I think it goes hand in hand with hopefully bringing up communicative, independent thinkers that it might. And my son, I remember even before we did the research, I remember when he was 3, somebody asked him, do you feel more German or more English? And he said at the time he felt more German than English. And when he was asked why, he said, because I can say Hoover, but I can't say Staubsauger. And to him, that was his gut response to this question. So I think identity is constructed in really funny ways as we grow up. And I think all we can do is keep coming back to that. And I'm just spotting a question from Trish there about how often did I address the issue of maybe starting German again. And I think the answer is I really didn't that much, not from a language perspective, but the whole aspect of me being German. My parents are still in Germany. My parents don't actually speak a heck of a lot of English, really. But we didn't actually go and visit them very much during that particular period of time. But I think it is about exploring this link between language and identity. And even if the language takes a gap, year or 2, there are still opportunities to encourage the identity. And I think if the identity is there, then at some point the child might say, actually, I'd quite like the language to back up this feeling inside of me. But I would be the first to say that it might also happen that the child says, do you know what, it also happens in reverse. The child might speak the language but say, this is not part of my identity. It's just a language that I speak. And no matter how much it hurts, I think that has to be okay. It might change at a later stage.
Yeah, it can change. I went through that several times, so it changed in my life. I know it changed in my children's life. But I think as we are speaking, we're talking about heritage language, reintroducing heritage language, but we also have to consider or to acknowledge that there are the other languages. And with the other languages in the life of our children, there's also this sense of belonging to other groups. So what I try to encourage to say to my children, and that would make me not feel not part of different groups, because I'm not that Italian, I'm not that German, not that, and we all are that, also Rita and Tetsu, I think. Every time we change group, we belong, but then we don't really that 100%. So what I tend to say is, you're not only, but also. So you're not only German, you're not only Chinese, you're not only Korean, etc., but also all the others. And that gives you a bit like this chameleon kind of touch. You stay your same as a person, but you can adapt, and this is actually what we want for our children, right? To be able to adjust to different languages, cultures, belongings, etc. So Rita, you wanted to ask something?
No, I was just thinking that there's so many different experiences, and like my daughters are adults, and I had a very kind of similar experience with my younger daughter, who was 6 when we moved to the UK from Finland, and she never learned Finnish before we moved because we spoke Swedish at home. But still, that Finnish was a very strong still in her. Yeah, I would say it's a part of her identity, because she was in her 20s when she decided, I'm going to go to a course. I want to take a course in Finnish because I want to learn this more. So I just want to bring this to the forth, that it's 2 years, or for you it was 8 years, Ute. In my case, she never learned it, but she had it as part of her, so she felt this need. So at university she took in her spare time she took a course in Finnish, and that was kind of 20 years later.
That's we never know, and every case is very, very different. So I would like to share 2 questions that are quite similar. First, the one from Josie. What about in the situation when the parent that moved overseas is not the parent trying to teach the heritage language? So when the other grandparents only speak the target language but are overseas, how do you encourage the identity?
So if I understand this correctly, this would happen if I'm trying to work out which parent is trying to encourage the heritage language here.
I think it's the one from the mother. Help me, Tetsu and Rita, if I'm right. And because we all know Josie. And then the other grandparents, which ones are these? Only speak the target language but are overseas. So they want to transmit the heritage language. It's probably the language of a partner. And the other grandparents who also speak that heritage language, let's call it A, are also overseas. So actually, let me share also the next question that goes, I think, in the same direction from Heather. Identity and language learning is a fascinating topic. I'm transmitting my husband's native language. I think there is an analogy in these 2 questions to my kids along with him. But I don't have the cultural knowledge or identity like he does. So I think it goes in the same direction. So if we transmit a language from a partner, or help our partner to transmit his or her language, and we don't have this connection, or we don't feel it as our language, I think that might be it.
Yeah, I think I understand it slightly differently. So I don't know, but I've as an example, I have worked with families where the main participant in my study was the parent who was English speaking, but they were the ones who were most interested in facilitating the husband's language, and their parents were overseas, but the husband himself, and I'm not making any assumptions, but I do not know Josie, but in this instance, in the study that I did, the husband wasn't that fussed about passing on the language. It was actually the English native speaker who wanted to make sure that this connection to the grandparents remained alive, etc. Whereas with Heather, there's more of the English native speaker or pushes or goes along with and tries to help the heritage language speaking partner to support the language. And I think that those are very different scenarios, because one speaks of unity of both parents trying to support the heritage language. Then there is like in our family, where it's essentially, you do you, it'll be all right. It'll be, there's easygoingness, but not necessarily, as I said, my husband hasn't actually learned German either. But then if it is a case of the non-native speaker of the heritage language, I'm going to say the English speaker, trying to push for a heritage language that they don't speak, but only the grandparents abroad speak, and the partner has no real interest in pushing. I do think that is really tricky, and I think there are. It depends. I say this from personal experience. I think it depends on the grandparents, and specifically on how technologically adept they are. My mother unfortunately cannot even operate a telephone anymore, so engaging grandparents then is very, very difficult. However, I also work with families where the grandparents are hugely active, and Skype, or especially after the year we've all just had, after the 15 months or so, people have found amazing ways. I've seen scenarios where you set up an iPad and the grandparents are there all through dinner. They're just it's family dinners, but across boundaries. Yeah, Rita, experience. So I think there are lots and lots of ways to tie physically distant family members. My son WhatsApps with my sister independently of me, and they don't necessarily do it often or all the time, but they, every now and then he says, "Oh, Auntie Catherine sent me this, that, or the other." So I think there are lots and lots of ways to use technology to try and integrate, and I think identity, to come back, because the question was about identity, comes from connection. So I think it's not necessarily about encouraging identity. I think it's about encouraging connection and hoping that the identity aspect will follow that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we are ready to wrap it up slowly. I'm looking at Tetsu. We often ask a question like, what would be 5 tips that you would like to share with parents who are considering to bring back at whatever stage, whether they are 2 years later, 5, 10, a language into their family at any given point of time?
Yeah, this is where I took notes, because I thought if I have to think of 5 on the spot, then but I think what I'm saying isn't necessarily going to come as a surprise after the past hour, because I want to start with take your lead from the child. I think that's been quite clear throughout everything that I've said. I think for me the most important aspect is to take your lead from the child. In fact, I think all my reasoning is related to each other, but depending on the age of a child, there might be a playful approach. If the child gets frustrated, it might start as simple as, how many body parts can we name together, and start helping, working it out, and celebrate the little successes, and kickstart from there. Try and start from successes, and it sounds really trite, but this success breeds success kind of, if it works for one thing, then try it with another thing. Say, can we cook a meal without lapsing into English? throw up little individual challenges that are time constrained. I've had families, I've encouraged some families to do like a little jar of little challenges that they could do like this, like, oh, in the shop, can you find 3 things without, if I sort of direct you, go turn left, turn right, or whatever, or cook a meal, or so there's lots and lots of different ways to create time sensitive challenges, for want of a better word, that don't make it so insurmountable. Oh, you're going to relearn this language. Okay, well, let's see how we do for the next 5 minutes. Can we do 5 minutes? And if we can do 5 minutes, can we do a quarter of an hour? And so I think there are lots and lots of ways to encourage that. I think what's also come through really clearly is that I'm very big on sharing your own emotions and thoughts, not as a way of guilting the child into certain behavior, but as a way of saying, I realize this is frustrating. I sometimes get frustrated too. What do you how do you feel about this? But make it part of a conversation. And whatever reasons the child gives must be validated. So it can't be that if a child says, I'm frustrated, and I'm not implying that anybody present would do this, but if a child shares that they are sad or angry or upset, oh, don't be silly, isn't the appropriate response to that. The appropriate response is, thanks for sharing that with me. What can we do to make it better? So it is about connecting. And I think that leads on to, I always phrase it as talking about language as much as talking in the language. And I don't mean explaining grammar points. I mean explaining potentially why you think learning that language would be a good idea in the first place. If the child doesn't understand, to come back to identity, if the child doesn't understand that the language is a core part of your identity, and for that reason you would like them to experience it, then if they only view it as words strung into sentences that have no emotional meaning, and they don't have any real need. I mean, in my context, for example, I don't need to communicate in German. I can make myself perfectly understood in English. So for a child, if Toby had said to me, well, you don't need to speak German to me. I understand it when you speak English. There needs to be a different reason. Understanding isn't the point. So I always say, make your reasons clear. Talk about your emotions. I'm not quite sure how I'm bullet pointing these. I'm not quite sure whether I'm up to 3 or 6 or something like that. I think I'm going to leave it at that as my my core nuggets.
I think that's so important what you say about speaking with your child about the language, because in my experience with many parents, they often underestimate what a child can understand. And they also feel that, why speak about me? I want my child to learn, but it's I'm always saying you need to be the role model, and you need to explain exactly as you say how important it is to you, and why you are doing this. And one additional trick which I always ask parents who want to introduce something, let's start with situations where everything is obvious from the context what you're doing. So when you take your daily routines, so and then you do a running commentary while you do that. So then the child can have the very important, like you mentioned, the very important success feeling. Hey, I understood what you say. They might think it that they understood from the language, although they understood it from the context. But to me, I'm fine with that as long as the child gets the kind of feel good feeling about understanding. Yeah.
And it can be phrased almost or experienced as a challenge or a quiz. And I'm just thinking of one example where I think it was about grapes, which in German is Weintrauben, which is very, very different from grape. If you don't know it, you're not going to know that means grape. And Toby was trying to find them, and the best way to describe it I could think of was neben den Bananen, which was much closer to so he found them next to the bananas. That was so exactly as you say, Rita. If you and then you highlight that, we managed that without lapsing. We could do it. We could do it for this long. Can we do it? So, yeah.
Oh my goodness. We want this to go on forever.
And we almost have, because this is the longest session that we have had, where we haven't said, well, now we're actually already over time. We haven't even mentioned it, and we're 15 minutes past the hour.
I mean, can you imagine? It's been a whole hour since I mentioned that we're 15 minutes into this conversation. It's a whole hour since I said that, and it feels like 5 minutes. Oh my goodness. Lots of very practical and emotion related discussion today. It's really a very, very enriching session. Thank you so much, Sabine. I don't know a better way to I think end this first year of Raising Multilinguals live for us. This session is session 24. We do 2 a month. So it's session 24. We've completed our 1-year anniversary. Next session in the early July will be our first of the 2nd year of Raising Multilinguals live. Isn't it amazing, Rita and Uta? A whole year of these amazing sessions. Wow. Thank you, Sabine. And thank you to all the audience members that have supported us over this past year. You've been there every 2 weeks on YouTube and on Facebook. Thank you so much. I do see lots of comments coming in at the last minute. I don't know, Uta and Rita, are you catching those?
Yes.
Lots of thanks to Sabine.
Thanks for fascinating journey from Tish. Heather, we've got time. This is wonderful. Well, Heather, you don't know what you're signing up for. Jenny, so inspiring, Sabine, as always.
Hi, Jenny.
I thought it might be someone you know. Veronica, many thanks for sharing all that, Sabine. Very interesting. And then we have also Talita, who is new. This is great. I'm new here, and I'm super happy to have found your page. Oh my, they're coming in. I don't know if I can share all of them. Josie, Heather again. Oops, sorry. And Malvina, thanks so much. Fantastic discussion as always, and thank you, Sabine.
I mean, if it's all right to say, I'm Googleable. If anybody wants to follow up or send me a message afterwards, feel free to get in touch. If there's anything I can help with, I'm very happy to be contacted.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much. Maybe we will also share some links to your articles that we mentioned, or to other studies that you mentioned in the description on YouTube. Okay.
And they will also be in the show notes when we get around to doing those.
Yeah. Yes.
Alrighty, so completing year 1 and moving on to year 2. Let me put up what's coming up in our next session.
Yes, we are very honored to announce that our next guest will be Professor Li Wei, Chair of Applied Linguistics and Director of the Center of Applied Linguistics, UCL, Institute of Education, and soon to be Dean of the University College London Institute of Education. And he will be our guest on Tuesday, 6th of July, and will share important insights into the topic of multi-competence in multilinguals, which should not be misunderstood from multilingual competence. And he will talk about the implication this multi-competence perspective has on the view of multilingual language learners. So please join us on Tuesday, 6th of July, at 1 p.m. New York, 6 p.m. London, and 7 p.m. Paris.
Thank you so much to everybody involved. And again, thank you, Sabine. A fantastic
Sabine.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Herzlichen
Thank you,
Dank.
everybody.
Bis zum nächsten Mal. Alla prossima.
All right.
Bye. Vi ses igen. Hej då.
Sayonara. See you next time.
Tot volgende